Chapter 27 of Miss Maitland, Private Secretary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Holly Jenson. Miss Maitland, Private Secretary by Geraldine BONNER. Chapter 27. Night on the Cresson Pike. The night fell stifling and airless, unfortunately favorable for the kidnappers, as the sky was covered with clouds and the country wrapped in a thick darkness. At 8:30, the roadster, with Ferguson driving, glided into the little village of North Cresson and swung out into the Cresson Turnpike. 10 minutes behind him was his touring car with Saunders, his chauffeur, at the wheel. 20 minutes later, a limousine was to strike into the pike from a road just beyond the village, and a runabout, emerging from an opposite direction, complete the chain. At the other end of the 10-mile limit, Chapman Price in the black racer was running up from the shore drive with 2 satellites, one his own motor, one a hired Ford, strung out behind him. Of a hot summer night at this hour, the pike was alive with autos, returning holiday-makers, city dwellers taking a spin in the country to cool off, joyriders rioting by, belated businessmen speeding to the seaside for the Sunday rest. They bore down on Ferguson like a procession of fleeing monsters, with round goblin eyes staring in affright. They came from behind, swinging across his path in a blur of dust, laughter and shrill cries rising from their crowded tonneaus. Keeping to their narrow track between the borders of the fields, they were like a turbulent, flashing torrent, dividing the darkness with a stream of streaked radiance, cutting the silence with a current of continuous sound. Ferguson's glance ranged ahead, dazzled by the glare of advancing lamps that enlarged on his vision, grew to a blinding haze and swept by. He could see little, blackness and brightness alternating, the motors emerging as dim solidities, realized for a passing moment, then gone. Once a small car, cutting across his bows from a side road, made him slacken, but it slowed round, showing the gnarled face of a farmer with a fat woman on the seat beside him and a bunch of children behind. As he went on, the press of vehicles thinned. The line of the road showed bare for longer stretches. The runabout overhauled him, kept by his side for a few yards, then drew ahead, its red tail lantern receding with an even skimming smoothness. A spot, a spark, nothing. He calculated he had covered nearly half the distance when the black racer passed in a soft purring rush, his eye, through the yellow fog that preceded it, catching a glimpse of Price's face. Then came a long straight level between fields, where only 2 cars went by, both going cityward. He looked back and tried to see the road behind him, straining his vision for a following shape, but the darkness lay close and unbroken, no goblin eyes peering through it in anxious pursuit. The road took a dive into woods, black as a cavern, the air breathless. It wound in sharp curves, his lamps sending their swinging rays into thickets, then out again on a hilltop, and down, swooping with a long, smooth glide into a valley. Here the touring car passed him, and he met a limousine, traveling at a pace as sober as his own. In its lit interior 2 men talking. After that, a farmer's wagon drawn up against the roadside grasses, the horse prancing in fractious fear. Then nobody. A wide strip of open country with sky setting down like an arched lid over the low circular surface of the land. It was very still, and his listening ear caught the buzzing hum of a vehicle behind him. This time he did not turn, but drew off further to the right, and a closed coupé swung by, with the jarring rattle of an old and loose-geared body. He was on the alert at once, its hooded shape suggesting secrecy, the surrounding loneliness apt for its design. Its taillight cast a bobbing crimson blot on the bed, and he saw its back, dust-grimed and rusty, and the numbered oblong of its license tag. That caused his expectancy to drop. The tag stood for respectability and honest wayfaring. Then, with a quickened leap of his heart, he realized that its speed was slackening. It slowed down to his own gait, and at the limit of his lamp's illumination moved before him, a square bulk, its back cut by a small window. He felt sure now, and with his hand on the wheel took a look over his shoulder. In the distance, cresting a rise, he saw 2 golden dots, too far for a speedy overtaking, and even if that were possible, he had no reason to suppose they belonged to any of his followers. A belt of woods spread across the way, and the road entered it as if tunneling a vault. It wound, looped and twisted, tree trunks and leafy hollows starting out as the long bright tubes swept over them. As one of these, slewing wide in a sharper turn, crossed the bank of the forward car, Ferguson saw an arm extended, and from the hand a white spark flashed twice. Almost immediately the coupé turned to the left and plunged into a byway, black as a pocket, the wood's thick growth crowding on its edges. The roadbed was good, and the leading car accelerated its speed, racing onward under the arching boughs. Ferguson, close on its heels, knew that the sounds of their going would be muffled by the enshrouding woodland, absorbed in its woven density. No chance either of meeting anyone. The way was one of those forest trails sought by the rich on their afternoon drives, but at night deserted by all but the birds and the squirrels. Cursing at the failure of his schemes, powerless now to protest or to retaliate, he followed until he knew by a freshening of the air that they were near the sound. The coupé's speed began to lessen and it came to a halt. Ferguson drew up a few rods behind it. He could see the trees about him picked out in detail, and behind them the engulfing darkness. The machine in front still seemed to shake and vibrate. He caught the sound of a step, and then a voice, a man's, deep and low-keyed.
"This is the place. Get out."
He jumped to the ground, discerning a shape by the coupé's door. He advanced, peering through his lantern's intervening glare, and made out it was alone. Stung with a quick fear, he halted and said, "Where's the child?"
"Here, put the money on the rock to your right."
The man came forward, a raised hand pointing to where the top of a rock showed among the wayside grasses. From the lifted hand, the light struck a silvery gleam, touching the barrel of a revolver. Ferguson, without moving, said, "I must see her first." He thought he detected a moment's hesitation. Then the man stepped back to the car and called a gruff,
"All right, quick, look."
He swung the coupé door open, and from an electric torch in his left hand sent a ray into the interior. The white shaft pierced the murk like a pointing finger. Its circular end, a spot of livid brightness, played on Babbitts curled on the floor asleep. Ferguson saw her as if cut from an encompassing blackness, transparently clear like a picture suspended in a void. Then the ray was extinguished, and as he stood, blinking against the obscurity, heard the man's voice,
"The money! On the rock there!"
and caught the gleam of the revolver barrel level with his eyes. He walked to the rock and laid the money, in an envelope clasped with rubber bands, on its flat surface. The whole thing seemed to him like a cheap melodrama, and he could have laughed as he righted himself and saw the round shining end of the revolver covering him, and the silent figure behind it. "Come on," he said. "Get to the rest. You tie me. Where?"
"The oak, behind you."
It was a large-sized tree back from the edge of the road, and he walked to it, hearing the man trampling the underbrush in his wake. He had a sense of a dreamlike quality in the whole fantastic performance, as if he might wake up suddenly and find he'd been having a nightmare. but there was nothing dreamlike in the force with which the rope was thrown about him and tightened round the tree. As he felt it strained across his chest, lashed round his legs, girding him to the trunk close at its bark, he recognized expertness and strength in the hands that bound him. The thing was done with extraordinary speed and deftness, and ended by a lump of waste that smelled of gasoline being thrust into his mouth. The heavy tread moved again through the underbrush. The man passed to the rock and, his back to Ferguson, crouched on the light's edges counting the money. Ferguson saw him in silhouette, a large humped body with bent head. This done, he went to the door of the coupé and lifted out the child. He had some difficulty in getting hold of her, muttered an oath, then drew her out, carried her to the roadside, and set her down on the grass. There was a moment when he crossed the full gush of illumination, and Ferguson had a clear glimpse of him, a chauffeur's cap on his head, the lower part of his face covered by a thick beard. Returning to his car, he jumped in. Its lurching start broke into a sudden flight. It rushed. Ferguson could hear the bounding of stones, the creaking and wrenching of its body as it hurtled down the road. Silence settled, the deep, dreaming quiet of the woods. The young man tried to struggle, to writhe and work himself loose, but his bonds held fast, and he found himself choked for air, stifling and snorting over his gag. He gave it up and looked at the child. By straining his eyes he could just see her, a small relaxed body, one hand outflung, her profile, held in a trance-like sleep, marble white against the grass. A hideous fear assailed him. She might be dead. Some drug had evidently been administered to keep her quiet. An overdose! He wrenched and pressed at the cords, almost strangled and had to stop, the sweat pouring into his eyes, his heart pounding on the rope that cut into his chest. He called on his will, felt himself steadied, his smothered breath came easier, the only sound on the silence. Then another broke upon it. Far away from the direction of the sound, a thin, clear report. He stiffened, all his faculties strained to listen. Heard it again, several in a spattering run, dropping distinct, like little globules piercing the stillness. Shooting, he thought with a wild surge of excitement. Out toward the water. Oh, Lord, have they got him? He listened again, but heard nothing. And then from the ground rose a moaning breath, a sleepy cry. Babbitts was awake. He wrenched his head till he could see her plainly, her face turned upward, the eyes still closed, the forehead puckered with a look of pain. He tried to emit some word, heard it only as a guttural mutter, and watching, saw her stir, the outstretched arm sway upward, her eyes open, dazed and heavy, and heard her drowsy whimper of, "Mummy," and then, "Oh, Annie, where are you?" Slowly, her head moving as her glance swept the unfamiliar prospect, she sat up. He remembered the next few minutes as something incredibly horrible, the child's consciousness clearing to an overwhelming fear. She looked about, saw him, scrambled to her feet and began to scream, shrill, terrified cries, crouching away from him like a scared animal. She made a rush for the motor, climbing in, cowering down, calling on the names that meant safety. "Mummy! Oh, Mummy! Gramp! Daddy! Come to me!" An answer came, the hollow bray of a motor horn, the shout of a man's voice, then the twin spears of light, the whirring buzz of a machine shooting out of the road's dark tunnel. Chapman Price in the black car. He leapt out and ran to her, caught her up, strained her to him, held her head back to look into her face, kissed her, babbled words of love that broke on his lips, and he hid his face on her neck. She twined round him, arms and legs clutching and clinging, sobbing out, "Popsy, Popsy," over and over. End of chapter 27. Recording by Holly Jenson. Chapter 28 of Miss Maitland, Private Secretary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Holly Jenson. Miss Maitland, Private Secretary by Geraldine BONNER. Chapter 28. The Man in the Boat. Price took Babbitta to Grasslands, handed her over to Annie, and telephoned in to the Janneys. Then he left to rejoin Ferguson, who was to go to the shore and find out the meaning of the shots. Price, missing the leading car, had decided that it had turned from the Pike and, scouring the side roads in a blind chase, had heard the shots, agreeing with Ferguson that they came from the direction of the sound. Ferguson went that way, driving at breakneck speed. He had almost reached the shore, felt the water's coolness, saw the wood's vista widen, when, to avoid a deep rut, he slewed his machine to the left. The lights penetrated a thicket, revealing behind the woven foliage a dark, large body, black among the tangled green. He drew up, peering at it. It was not a rock. Its sides showed smooth through the boughs. He jumped out and pushed his way through the bushes. It was a taxi, its lamps extinguished, broken branches and crushed foliage marking its track. It gave evidence of a violent flight and a hasty desertion, careened to one side, its door open, a rug hanging over the step. He went to the back, struck a match and looked at the license tag. The number was that of the motor he had followed. Covered by the darkness, driven deep among the trees, it could easily have passed unnoticed until the daylight betrayed it. The plan of escape revealed a new artfulness. The man had made off either on foot or in another vehicle. It accounted for the license. He knew his pursuers would mark it and look for a car carrying that number. In the face of such a crafty completeness of detail, the young man felt himself reduced to a baffled indecision. Cogitating on the various routes his quarry might have taken, he ran out onto the shore road and here again halted. Before him the Sound lay, a smooth dark floor, along which glided the small golden glimmerings of river craft. He looked up and down the road, discernible as a gray path between the upstanding solidity of the woods and the flat solidity of the water. Some distance in front, a black blot took shape under his exploring glance as a small house. He started the car and ran toward it, seeing as he approached a dancing yellow spot come from behind it in swaying passage. He stopped. The yellow spot steadied, rose, swung aloft, a lantern in the hands of a man, half-dressed, who came toward him spying out from under the upraised glow. Ferguson spoke abruptly. "Did you hear shots a while ago?" The man, setting his lantern on the ground, spoke with the slow phlegm of the native. "I did. Close here. I been down to the waterside seeing if I could make out what they was." The house was skirted by a balcony along which a second light now came into view, this time from a lamp carried in the hand of a woman. She was wrapped in a bedgown, a straggle of loose hair hanging round a frightened face. "We was asleep and they woke us up. They was right off there." She jerked her head to the Sound behind her. "From the water?" Ferguson asked. "Sounded that way." The man took it up. "We wasn't sure at first what it was. Then they come crack, crack, one after the other, from somewheres beyont. My wife, she said it was motorboats. Said she heard 'em off across the water. But by the time we got something on and was outside, it was over. There wasn't no more and we couldn't see nothing. I been down on the beach looking round, thinking they might have come from there, but I ain't found no tracks or signs of anybody." "I was wonderin'," said the woman, "if maybe it was that patrol boat, the one they got this summer running along the shore for thieves, that they caught a sight of one and went after him." Ferguson was silent for a moment, then said, "Is there any place round here where a boat could be hidden, deep enough water for a launch?" The man answered, "Yes, right down the road a step there's a cove and an old dock. Used to belong to the folks that lived on the bluff, but the house burned down a while back and ain't been rebuilt, and no one's used the dock since. A feller could hide a boat there fine. It's all overgrown so you can't see it unless you know where it is." "I'd like to take a look at it," said Ferguson. "Come along with the lantern." The place was only a few yards from the mouth of the wood road. Trees and shrubs sheltered it, concealing with their rank growth a small wharf, rotted and sagging to the waterline. The lantern rays revealed a recent presence: scattered leaves and twigs on the wooden planking, the long marshy grasses showing a track from the road to the wharf's edge. "Yes, sir," said the native, much impressed. "Someone's been here tonight, and not so long ago either. You can see where the dew's been swept off the grasses right to the water." Ferguson said nothing. He now saw the whole plan of escape: the coupé left in the woods, a short run to the cove where a boat had been concealed, the getaway down on across the Sound. What had the shots meant? Was the woman right in thinking the police patrol had come upon the fleeing criminal? And if they had, what had been the result? Lantern in hand, the man at his heels, he crushed through the swampy copse to the shore. There his glance swept the long stretch of the water, sown in the distance with a pattern of moving sparks. Two of them, red and green, stole over the ebony surface toward him, advancing with an even gliding smoothness, piercing and steady, like the eyes of a stealthily approaching animal, fixing him with a meaning scrutiny. He snatched up the lantern and ran for a point that jutted out in a pebbly cape. Standing on its tip, he raised and waved the light, letting his voice ring out across the stillness. "Boat ahoy!" The lights drew closer, their reflections stabbing down into the oily depths, gleam below gleam. The pulsing of a muffled engine came with them. A prow took shape, a shine of wood and brass above the lusterless tide. Ferguson called again, "Who are you?" An answer rose in a man's surly voice. "What's that to you?" "A good deal. I'm Ferguson of Council Oaks, and I'm looking for the boat that fired on someone round here about an hour ago." The voice replied, its tone changed to sudden conciliation. "Oh, Mr. Ferguson, couldn't see who it was. We're what you're looking for, the police patrol. We have the launch here in tow. Have you got the man?" "Yes, sir. He didn't answer our challenge and fired on us. We chased and gave it back to him. A running fight. One of us got him. He's dead." "Go on to my wharf. I'll be there when you come." On his way along the shore road he met Price, paused for a quick explanation, and the two cars ran at a racing clip to Ferguson's wharf. The men were standing on its end when the police boat glided into the gush of light that fell from the high electric lamps at either side of the ship. Behind it, lifted and dropped by the languid wavelets, was a launch, a covered shape lying on the floor. The story of the police was quickly told. The night, dark and windless, was the kind chosen by the water thieves for their operations. The men had been on the watch, faring noiselessly with engine muffled and hooded lamps. It was nearly the end of their run, a length of shore with few estates, when they saw a boat glide from a part of the beach peculiarly dark and deserted. The craft carried no lights, a fact that instantly roused their suspicions, and they waited. As it drew out for the open water they challenged. There was no answer, but a sudden acceleration of its speed, shooting by them like a streak for the mid-reaches of the Sound. They started in pursuit, repeating their challenge, and then an order to lie to. Again there was no response, and they clapped on top speed and raced in its wake. They were gaining on it when, in answer to a louder hail, the man fired on them, the bullet passing between two of them and burying itself in the gunwale. They replied with a return fire. There was a fusillade of shots, and the two boats sped in a darkling rush across the Sound. They knew something was wrong with their opponent. His launch headed in a straight line, swept through the wash of steamers, cut across the bows of tugs and river craft, rocking like a cockleshell, menaced by destruction, shouts and objurgations following its mad course. They were up with it, almost alongside on the last lap. He made no answer to their hails, sat upright and motionless, sat so when his bow crashed against the rocks of the Connecticut shore. They found him dead, a bullet in his brain, the wheel still gripped in his hands. Ferguson dropped into the launch and drew down the coat that had been thrown over the body. The face, the false beard gone, was handsome, the body large and powerful, the hands fine and well kept. It was not the type he had expected to see. He felt in the pockets and found the money still in its envelope, clasped by the rubber bands. There were no other papers, no means of identification. After a short colloquy with the men, he and Price drove back to Council Oaks. Price left the next morning. His presence was necessary in the city, he said, and he seemed preoccupied and anxious to go. He hinted at forthcoming revelations which would clear up what was still unexplained, but declared himself unable at present to say more. When he had gone, Ferguson walked to Grasslands, where he found the family recuperating in a relief too deep for words. Babbitts was in bed, still asleep. The doctor, sent for the night before, said she was suffering from the effects of a drug, but that rest and quiet would soon restore her. They collected on the balcony to hear his story. When it was over, questions answered, amazement and horror vented in various forms, Mr. Janney said he would like to walk over to the wharf and have a talk with the police himself. Ferguson decided to go with him. There would be a lot of business to be gone through, an inquest with all its unpleasant detail. As they rose to leave, Suzanne announced that she wanted to come too. She looked a wreck, in her hysterical jubilation forgetful of her rouge and powder, a worn little wraith of a woman whose journey to the heart of life had stripped her of all coquetry and beauty. They tried to dissuade her, but as usual she was insistent. She wanted to see the men herself. She wanted to hear everything. On this day of Thanksgiving, no one had the will to thwart her, so they accepted with the best grace they could, and she walked through the woods with them. There was a group of men on the wharf, the local police, the coroner, some of Ferguson's employees. The body had been put in the boathouse, laid on a table under a sheltering tarpaulin. Ferguson and Mr. Janney drew off to the end of the dock in low-toned conference with the officials. They were relieved to see that Suzanne had no mind to listen, but stayed by herself in the shade of the boathouse wall. She leaned against it, looking out over the sparkling reaches of the Sound. Her thoughts were of the dead man, close behind her there, on the other side of the wooden partition. She wondered with an awed amaze at his wild act and its dark ending. She wondered what manner of man he was, what he was like, a human creature, unknown to her, who could want only to cause her such anguish. She shot a glance over her shoulder and saw that the door of the boathouse was half open. The coroner had been in and had neglected to close it. She looked at the men at the end of the wharf. They stood in a little cluster, backs toward her, heads together in animated discussion. She moved from the wall, advanced on tiptoe through the slant of shade, and slipped through the open doorway. The place was very still, its clear varnished brownness impregnated with the sea's salty tang. Through its windows the golden gleam of the waves reflected in rippling lights that chased across its peaked ceiling. She stole to the table where the grim shape lay and lifted the tarpaulin with a trembling hand. The other shot suddenly to her mouth, strangling a scream, and she dropped the heavy cloth as if it burned her. Both hands went up over her face, flattened there until the nails were empurpled, and she stood, bent as if cramped with pain, for the moment all movement paralyzed. Ferguson, informed of all he wanted to know, turned from the others to join her. She was not where he had left her, and moving down the wharf he looked about, and seeing no sign of her, decided that she had gone home. He was passing the boathouse doorway when she came through it almost upon him. "Good heavens!" he said angrily. "Have you been in there?" Then, seeing her face, he caught her arm and held her. Would there ever be an end to her willfulness?
Come home,
he said sharply, and led her away. She tottered beside him, drooping and ghastly. As they crossed the road to the path up the bluff, he could not forbear an exasperated, "What in the name of common sense did you do that for? Didn't you know it was not a thing for you to see?" Her hands locked on his arm. She leaned against him, lifting a haggard glance to his face. Her voice was a husky whisper. "It's not that, Dick. It wasn't just the dead man. He was my detective, Larkin." End of chapter 28. Recording by Holly Jenson. Chapter 29 of Miss Maitland, Private Secretary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Holly Jenson. Miss Maitland, Private Secretary by Geraldine BONNER. Chapter 29. Miss Maitland Explains. On Saturday afternoon, several telephone messages were sent to Esther Maitland at O'Malley's flat. They came from Ferguson, from Grasslands, and the Whitney office. In the two latter cases, they were conciliatory and apologetic, and asked that Miss Maitland would see the senders and explain the circumstances that had so strangely involved her in the case. To both her employers and the Whitneys, Miss Maitland returned an evasive answer. She would be happy to do as they asked, but would have to let a few more days pass before she would be free to speak. Meantime, she would remain with Mrs. O'Malley, who had offered to keep her, and who had treated her with the utmost kindness and consideration. One request she made, this to the Whitneys. She would like Chapman Price to be advised of her whereabouts. It would be necessary for her to communicate with him before she would be able to explain her share in the mystery. Ferguson's message had been an importunate demand to let him come to her. She refused, said she would see no one until she was at liberty to clear herself, which would not be for some days yet. Her voice showed a tremulous urgency, a note of pleading, new to his ears and infinitely sweet. But he could not break down her resolution. She begged him to do as she asked, not to seek her out, not to demand any explanations, until she was ready to give them. The one favor she granted him was that when the time was up and she could break her silence, he could come for her. This did not happen until Wednesday. That morning she phoned to them all that she could now see them and tell them what they wanted to hear. A meeting was arranged at the Whitney office for 3 that afternoon, and Ferguson went to fetch her. They met in Mrs. O'Malley's front parlor, considerately vacated and with the folding doors closed against intrusion. Without greeting, Ferguson took her hands and held them, looking down into her face. She was beaming, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shy. She began to say something about being at last able to vindicate herself, but he cut her off. "Before you go into that, I want to say something to you." "No, that's not fair. I must speak first and you must let me. It's my privilege."
With the others, maybe, but not with me. What I have to say has to be said before I hear. Esther, do you know what it is?" She was silent, her head drooping, her hands growing cold in his grasp. He went on very quietly and simply. "It's that I ask you to be my wife, and I must ask it before the clearing or vindicating or any rubbish of that sort. I don't know what you'll say to it, and I don't want any answer now. That's at your own good time and your own good pleasure. It's just that I wanted you to see how I stand and have stood since that night when we walked through the woods together. Come along now, it's nearly 3 and we mustn't keep them waiting." It was a very different Esther who sat in Wilbur Whitney's private office, facing those who had once been her accusers. She gave no evidence of rancor, greeted them with a frank friendliness, smiled with a radiance they set down to the rebound from long tension and strain. Suzanne, her jealous fires burned out, could acknowledge now that she was handsome. Mr. Janney wondered at her look of breeding. "A fine girl," old Whitney thought as he studied her through his glasses. "Spirited and high-mettled as a racer." "It's a long story," she said, "and for you to understand it I'll have to go back to a time when none of you had ever heard of me. And before I begin I want to say to Mrs. Janney," she turned to the older woman, eagerly earnest, "if I had understood people better, if I hadn't been hardened and made suspicious by the struggle I'd had, I would have trusted you and told you more, and all this misery would have been averted. So in a way it was my fault, and being such I've suffered for it. I have a half-sister, Florence Jackson, 9 years younger than I am. That would make her 18. When my stepfather died 10 years ago, he left us penniless and I had to start in at once to make our bread. I boarded Florrie out with friends and found a position as a school teacher. That was only for a year or 2. Soon I advanced into the secretarial work, which was less fatiguing and better paying. In the first place I got, Florrie was living near me, and on Sundays she used to come and see me. My employer didn't like it, did not want a strange child about the house, and told me so without mincing words. I was angry, I was hot-tempered and sensitive in those days, and I made a vow to keep my life to myself, be nothing to my employers but a machine who rendered certain services for a certain wage. When I came to you, Mrs. Janney, I should have seen that I was with someone who was big-hearted and generous, but I had been molded, and the mold had set in a hard and bitter shape. Earning more money, I was able to put Florrie in good schools. It was my intention to give her a fine education and equip her for the task of earning her living. She was quick and clever, but willful and hard to control. I suppose it was because she had had no home influences, no place that belonged to her. She had to spend her vacations anywhere, sometimes at the school, sometimes with classmates. It was a miserable life for a child. She was always pretty. When she was little, people used to stop on the streets to look at her. And as she grew older, she grew prettier. She was charming too. There was something about her very willfulness that was captivating. The combination worried me. If she had had more balance, been more reasonable, it wouldn't have mattered. But she was the kind who is always full of wild enthusiasms, going off at a tangent about this, that, and the other. Not a promising temperament for a girl who has to support herself. A year ago, I got her into a first-class school near Chicago. I had met the principal, who had been very kind and taken her at a greatly reduced rate. It was to be her last year. In June she would graduate, and with her education finished, I felt sure I could get her a position in New York, where I could help her and watch over her. During the winter, last winter, her letters made me uneasy. She was discontented, tired of study, wanted to be out in the world doing something. I was prepared for a struggle with her, but not for what happened. One day, it was in March, I had a letter from her saying she had run away from school, was in New York, and was looking for a job. I was angry and bitterly disappointed. Also, I was frightened.
Florrie in New York without a cent, with no one to be with her, with no home or companion? I went to the address she gave me and found her in the hall bedroom of a third-rate boarding house. A woman on the train had told her of it, full of high spirits and a sort of childish joy at being free. She did not understand my disappointment, laughed at my fears. I lost my temper, said more than I ought, and well, we had a quarrel. The first real one we ever had. That night I couldn't sleep, blaming myself, knowing that whatever she did it was my duty to stand by her. The next day I went to the place and found she'd gone, leaving no address. For 3 days I heard nothing from her, and was on the verge of going to you, Mrs. Janney, and imploring your aid and advice, when a letter came. She was all right. She had found paying employment. She was independent at last. In my first spare hour I went to her and found her in another boarding house, a cheap, shabby place, but decent. A good many working women lived there, the better paid shop girls and heads of departments. It was through one of these, a fitter at Camille's, that she had got work. With her beauty it had been easy. She had been employed as a model at Camille's. Camille's? The word came on a startled note from Suzanne. Esther turned to her. Yes, Mrs. Price, and you saw her there. You ordered a dress from a model that Florrie wore. The girl with the reddish hair? The tall girl? Yes, that was Florrie. She told me afterward how she walked up and down in front of you. But... Suzanne's voice showed an incredulous wonder. She was beautiful. They were all talking about her. I said she was. I was not exaggerating. She was satisfied with her work, liked it. I think she would have liked anything that was novel and took her away from the grind of study. I didn't like it, but at least it wasn't the stage, and I set about trying to find something better. That was the situation till April, and then she paused, her eyes dropped to the floor. The color suddenly rose in her face, and raising them, she shot a look at Ferguson. He answered it with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and smiled in open encouragement. She took a deep breath and addressed Mrs. Janney. What I have to tell you now isn't pleasant for me to say or for you to hear, but I have to tell it, for all the subsequent events grew from it. Mr. Price had been to Camille's that first time with his wife. There was a slight stir in the listening company, a sudden focusing of intent eyes on the girl, a waiting expectancy in the grave faces. She saw it and answered it. Yes, he saw Florrie. He went again. Mrs. Price was buying several dresses. After that second visit, he waited one night at the side door used for employees and spoke to her. I can't condone what she did, but I can say in extenuation that she was very young, very inexperienced, that she knew who Mr. Price was, and that she had never in her life met a man of his attractions. She didn't hide it from me, was frank and outspoken about the meeting and his subsequent attentions. For he saw her often after that, took her for walks on Sunday, sent her theater tickets and books. I was filled with anxiety, besought of her to give it up, but she wouldn't. She couldn't. Before I went to Grasslands, I realized a situation was developing that made me sick with apprehension. She was in love, madly in love. I couldn't reason with her. I couldn't make her listen to me. She was blind and deaf to anything but him and what he said. I went to Mr. Price and implored him to leave her alone. I had to catch him as I could, in the halls, at odd moments in the library, for he hated the scenes I made and tried to avoid me. He assured me that he meant no harm, that her position was hard and he was sorry for her. I threatened to tell Mrs. Janney, and he said I could if I wanted, that he would soon be done with them all and didn't care. I saw then that he too, like Florrie, was growing indifferent to everything but the hours when they were together, that he was in love. That was the situation when I went to Grasslands. It was much worse there. I couldn't see her often. I was in ignorance of how things were going with her, for her letters told me little. It was unbearable, and I went into town whenever I could. All the extra holidays were asked for so that I could go into the city and see how Florrie was getting on. On one of these visits she told me something that at the time I paid little attention to, setting it down as one of her passing fancies. She was interested in the working girls' unions. At Camille's and in the boarding house she had fallen in with a group of girls of socialistic beliefs, and through them had met their organizers and backers. She was much more deeply involved than I guessed. Her fearlessness, her ardor for anything new and exciting, making her a valuable addition to their ranks. It carried her far, to the edge of tragedy. She turned to Mr. Janney. "Do you remember, Mr. Janney, one morning in early July, how I read you an account of a strike riot among the shirtwaist makers, when one of the girls stabbed a policeman with a hat pin?" The old man nodded. "Yes, vaguely. I have a dim memory of arguing about it with you." "That was the time. Well, that girl was Florrie. She lost her head completely, stabbed the man, and in the tumult that followed, managed to get away through the hall of a tenement house. She was hidden by friends of hers, Russian socialists, called Riklovsky. I have met them. They seem decent, kindly people, and they certainly were very good to her. When I read you the article I had no more idea that the girl was Florrie than you had. It was not until the next morning that I received a letter from her telling me what she had done and where she was. She wrote 2 letters, one to me and one to Mr. Price. He had told her that he would spend his weekends with the Hartleys at Cedar Brook, and she sent his there. Mine was delivered on the morning of July the 7th, but he did not get his until the same evening when he came to Cedar Brook from the city. Each of us acted as promptly as we could, but he went to her before I did, going in that night in his car. It seems incredible that he should have done what he did, dared to take such a risk. But when he found her cooped up in the rear room of a tenement, lonely and frightened, he prevailed on her to go out with him in his motor. He took her for a drive far up the Hudson, not returning until after midnight. The Riklovskys, who had missed her and were in a state of alarm, were furious. When I went there the next day, they were vociferous in their desire to be rid of her, saying she would land them all in jail. I was her sister. It was up to me. I must find another lair for her. I had heard of the house in Gale Street from 2 girls, art students who had once lived there. It was the only place I could think of, and when I found that the top floor was vacant, I realized that she could be hidden in one of the rooms and no one suspect it was occupied. I engaged it and paid the rent, telling the janitor the story of a friend coming from the West. Then I took the key back to Florrie. The Riklovskys, pacified by the thought that she would be out of their house, undertook to furnish her with food. They made her promise that she would keep to the room, light no gas at night, make no noise, and stay away from the window. Florrie was by this time thoroughly cowed and agreed to everything. It was through their adroitness that the room passed as vacant. They visited her in the evening, a time when many people came and went in the house, bringing in her food and carrying away what was left in newspapers. They had 2 extra keys made, one for me, one for Mr. Price. I brought her money, Mr. Price books and magazines. He saw her oftener than I did and gave me news of her. This I asked him to do by letter. I had once met him by Little Fresh Pond, and another time he had telephoned. I was afraid of repeating the meeting at the pond. We had both come upon Miss Rogers and Babbitts on the way out, and I dreaded being overheard at the phone. All went well for 2 weeks, though we were terribly frightened, for the policeman developed blood poisoning, and for some time hung between life and death. Then the Riklovskys suggested a plan that seemed to me the only way out of our dangers and difficulties. A friend of theirs, a woman doctor, was one of a hospital unit sailing from Montreal to France. This woman, allied with them in their socialistic activities, agreed to get Florrie into her group as a hospital attendant, take her to France and look after her. It struck us all as feasible and as lacking in danger as any plan for her removal could be. The doctor was a woman of high character who told the Raclowskis she would keep Florrie near her as the unit was short-handed and needed all the workers it could get. The one person who showed no enthusiasm was Florrie herself. I knew perfectly what was the matter. She did not want to leave Chapman Price. He tried to persuade her, was as worried and anxious as I was. The situation between them had cleared to a definite understanding. When his wife had obtained her divorce, he would go to France and marry Florrie there. And now I come to the day of the kidnapping, that dreadful, unforgettable day. The morning before, Thursday, I had seen her and found her in a state of nervous indecision, weeping and miserable. I knew I was to be in town with Mrs. Price the next day, and told her if I could get time I would come to her. Mrs. Price had told me how we were to divide the errands, and I realized if I could finish mine earlier than she expected, I would have a chance of seeing Florrie. I had just been paid my salary, and that, with some money I had saved, I brought with me. My intention was to give all this to Florrie and implore her to go with the hospital unit, which was scheduled to leave Montreal early the following week. Things worked out as I had hoped. The commissions took less time than Mrs. Price had calculated, and I found that I would be able to spend a few minutes with Florrie. In case Babbitts should mention the excursion downtown, I ordered the driver to drop me at a bookbindery on the corner of Gale Street. I could easily explain our stop there by saying that I had left a book to be bound. When I reached the room, I found her in a state of hysterical terror. She said the house was watched. Peeping out through the coarse lace curtains that veiled the window, she had several times noticed a man lounging about the corner. At first she had thought nothing of him, but the day before he had reappeared and stayed about the block most of the afternoon, covertly watching the entrance and the upper floor. I was nearly as frightened as she was. The thing was only too probable. There was no difficulty in getting her to go with the hospital ship. She had only stayed on in the hope of seeing me and having me tell her what to do. I gave her the money and told her to wait until nightfall and then slip out and go to the Raclowskis. They had promised to help her in any way they could, and with Babbitts waiting in the cab, I couldn't go with her. It was a simply hideous position to have to leave her that way, but it was all I could think of. It came so unexpectedly I was stunned by it. When I reached the bookbindery, the taxi was gone. Can you imagine what I felt? I told the truth when I said my first thought was that Babbitts might have played a joke on me. I did think that, for my mind, confused and crowded with deadly fears, could not take in a new catastrophe. Then, when I saw Mrs. Price and realized that the child had mysteriously disappeared, while with me, while in my charge, I hope I'll never have to live over moments like those again. I had to keep one fact before my mind, to be quiet, to be cool, not to do or say anything that might betray Florrie. If I'd known what you suspected, I couldn't have done it. But of course, I hadn't any idea then you thought I was implicated. Florrie had told me she would communicate with Mr. Price, and he would give me word of her. The telephone message that Miss Rogers tapped was that word, all I received. It relieved me immensely. I began to feel the dreadful strain relaxing. I began to think we were on the high road to safety. And then came that day here in the office. Shall I ever forget it? She turned to Mrs. Janney. If I had had the least idea of what was going to be done here, I would have tried to get to you and have thrown myself on your mercy. But I was completely unsuspecting and unprepared, and with Mr. Whitney as the judge, representing the law, I did not dare to tell the truth. I had to lie. As you saw, I lied as well as I could, puzzled at first, not knowing what you were getting at, to what point it was all leading. Then, when you caught me with the tapped message, I guessed how circumstances had woven a net about me. I realized there was nothing to be done but let you believe it, let you do what you wanted with me. You couldn't make me speak, and if I could stay silent till Florrie was in Europe, hidden, lost in the chaos of a country at war, it would be all right." She swept their faces with a glance, half pleading, half triumphant. "She is there now. This morning Mr. Price had a cable from her. I have told this to Mr. Whitney as well as the rest because I have thought, shut up in O'Malley's flat I had much time for thinking things out straight and clear, that after my explanation no one would dare to bring that unfortunate girl back here to face a criminal charge. She has had her lesson. She will never forget it. The man she wounded is back on the force as good as ever. No human being with a conscience and a heart," she looked at Whitney, "and you have both, could want to make her pay more bitterly than she has. She is safe, under intelligent supervision. She can work, be useful, where her youth and strength and enthusiasm are needed. I did not trust you before, Mr. Whitney, but I do now, and I know that my trust is not misplaced." A murmur, a concerted sound of agreement, came from her listeners. Whitney, pushing his chair back from the desk, said gravely, "You can rest assured, Miss Maitland, that the matter will die here with us today. As you say, your sister has had her punishment. She will stay in France, of course." "Yes, make her home there, I think. When Mr. Price is free he is to go over and marry her. He intends to sell his business out and offer his services to the French government." There was a moment of silence, then Mrs. Janney spoke, clearing her throat, her face flushed with feeling. "As you've said, Miss Maitland, none of this would have happened if you'd seen fit to come to me. But it's no use going over that now. We've all made mistakes and we're all sorry. What we, the Janneys, want to do is to be fair, to be just, and now, if it's not too late, to make amends. The only way you can show your willingness to forget and forgive is to come back at once to Grasslands and take things up where you left them." The girl for a moment did not answer, her face reddening with a sudden embarrassment. Mrs. Janney saw the blush, read it as reluctance, and exclaimed, "Oh, Miss Maitland, don't say you refuse. It's as if you wouldn't take my hand held out in apology, in friendship." "No, no," Esther was obviously distressed. "Don't think that, Mrs. Janney. It's not that. It's that I can't. I've made another engagement. I'm going to marry Mr. Ferguson." End of chapter 29. Recording by Holly Jenson. Chapter 30 of Miss Maitland, Private Secretary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Holly Jenson. Miss Maitland, Private Secretary by Geraldine BONNER. Chapter 30. Molly's Story. It's my place to finish. Tell the end of the story and straighten it all out. Some of it's been cleared up clean, with the people on the spot to give the evidence. Some of it we had to work out from what we knew and what we guessed. Willits, who was a gamey guy, told his tale from start to finish, and loved doing it, they said, like an actor who'd rather be dead in the spotlight than alive in the wings. Larkin's part we had to put together from what we could get from Babbitts and what Mrs. Price gave up. Babbitts, the way children do, saw plain, and could tell what she saw as accurate as a phonograph. It made tears come to hear the dear little thing, so sweet and innocent, making us see that even the crooks she was with couldn't help but love her. When Miss Maitland got out of the taxi at the bookbindery, the driver told the child that he knew her daddy and could take her round to see him while Miss Maitland was in the store. He said it wouldn't take long, that Mr. Price was close by, and they would come back in a few minutes and pick up Miss Maitland. Babbitts was crazy to go, and he started, giving her a box of chocolates to eat on the way. Of course, she never could tell where he went, but it could not have been a long distance, or Larkin, we all were agreed that he drove the cab, couldn't have reached the Fifth Avenue house as soon as he did. The place was evidently a flat over a garage. He told her her father was waiting there, went upstairs with her, and gave her in charge of a woman called Marion who opened the door for them. During the whole time she was gone she stayed here with Marion, who every morning assured her her daddy would come that day. She said Marion was very good to her, gave her toys and candies, cooked her meals, and played games with her. She cried often and was homesick, and Marion never scolded her, but used to take her in her arms and kiss her and tell her stories. She never saw the man again until he came to take her away, but sometimes the bell rang, and Marion went out on the stairs and talked to someone. One evening, Marion said she was going home. It would be a long drive and she must be a good girl. Marion dressed her and then gave her a glass of milk and kissed her a great many times and cried. Babbitts cried too, for she was sorry to leave Marion, but she wanted to go home. After that, the man came and took her downstairs to the taxi and told her to be very quiet and she'd soon be back at Grasslands. It was dark and they went through the city, and then she got very sleepy and laid down on the seat. No trace of Marion, Larkin's confederate, could be found, and in fact no especial effort was made to do so. The man was dead. The woman, who had evidently treated the child with affectionate care, had fled into the darkness where she belonged. The family, even Mrs. Janney, was contented to let things drop and make an end. When it came to Larkin, we had to piece out a good deal. We agreed that he had started in fair and honest, had tried to make good and had failed. At just what point he changed we couldn't be sure, but Ferguson thought it was after Mrs. Price threatened to end the investigation. Then he realized that his big chance was slipping by, determined to get something out of it, and hit on the kidnapping. It was easy to see how he could worm all the data he wanted out of Mrs. Price. From what she said, he'd evidently pumped her at their last meeting in town, finding out just what her plans were, even to the fact that she intended taking the extra cab from the rank round the corner. I thought that one thing might have given him the whole idea. When they stopped at the bookbindery, he heard Miss Maitland tell Babbitts she would be gone a few minutes, and he knew that was his opportunity. He took the child to the place he had ready for her, made a quick change, not more than the shedding of his coat, cap, and goggles, and ran his car into the garage below, which of course he must have rented. Then he lit out for the Fifth Avenue house, a bit late but ready to report in case Miss Maitland didn't show up before him. Miss Maitland did. He must have seen her go in, but he rang just the same, which showed what a cunning devil he was. He must have been surprised when he didn't see anything in the papers, but after he'd written the first Klansman letter to Mrs. Price, she explained that, and it made it smoother sailing for him. Knowing her as well as he did, he planned the letters to scare her into silence, and saw before he was through he had her exactly in the state he wanted. The one place where his plot was weak was that an outsider had to drive the rescue car, but he had to take a chance somewhere, and this was the best place. He'd fixed it so neat that even if the outsider had informed on him, he'd have been wary and, as Ferguson thought, not shown up at all. He'd done it well, as well, we all agreed, as it could be done. What had beaten him had been no man's cleverness, just something that neither he nor you nor any of us could have foreseen. Ain't there a proverb about the best laid plans of mice and men slipping up when you least expect it? It was like the hand of something that reached out sudden and came down hard, laid him dead in the moment when the goal was in sight. As to Willits, he was some boy. They found out that he was wanted in England, well known there as an expert safecracker and notorious jewel thief. That's where he's gone, to live in a quiet little cell which will be his home from this time forth. He said he hadn't been in New York long before he heard of the Janney jewels and went into Mr. Price's service, but he couldn't do anything while the family were in town. The safe was right off the pantry. Too many people about, and anyway, it was a new one, the finest kind, that would have baffled even his skill. He would have left discouraged, but one day Dixon let drop that the safe at Grasslands was old-fashioned, put in years before by the former owners. So he stayed on devoted and faithful. At Grasslands he had lots of time to try his hand on the ancient contraption in the passage. He worked on it until he found the combination, and then he lay low for his opportunity. When the row came and Mr. Price left, he stayed on with him. It was the best thing to do, as he could run in and out from Cedarbrook, seeing the servants, with whom he was careful to be friendly. Before this, he'd got wise to the fact that something was up between Miss Maitland and Mr. Price. He said it was his business to snoop, and his profession had got him into the way of doing it instinctive, but I'd set it down as coming natural. Anyway, he'd found out that there was a secret between them. He'd surprised them murmuring in the hallways in the library, quieting down quick if anyone came along. He made the same mistake as the rest of us, thought it was an affair of the heart, and grew mighty curious about it. He didn't explain why he was interested, but if you asked me, I'd say he had blackmail in the back of his head. On the afternoon of July the 7th he biked down from Cedarbrook to take a look round and see how things were progressing. Familiar with the ways of the house, he knew the family would be out, and stole round past Miss Maitland's study. No one was there, and, curious as he was, he slipped in to do a little spying. Miss Maitland and Mr. Price separated would be writing to each other, and a letter might throw some light on the darkness. He rummaged about among the papers but found nothing. Scattered over the desk were bits of the trimming Miss Maitland had been sewing on. A pile of the little rosebuds was lying on the top of her work basket. Reaching over toward a bunch of letters, he upset the basket, and, scared, he swept up the contents with his handkerchief, putting them back as quick as he could. This was the way he explained the presence of the rose in the safe. He was shocked at anyone thinking that he had tried to throw suspicion on such a fine young lady. That night, taking the jewels, hot and nervous, his glasses had blurred the way they do when your face perspires. He had whisked out his handkerchief to wipe them, and no doubt a rosebud lodged in the folds had fallen to the ground. Mr. Ferguson didn't believe this. He thought the rose was a plant, but I did. It was one of those queer, unexpected things that will happen, and that for me always puts a crimp in circumstantial evidence. After that, he went round to the kitchen and heard of the general sortie for that evening. Then he knew the time had come. He biked back to Cedarbrook, saw Mr. Price, and went to his lodgings. Here he found his landlady's child sick with the croup and offered to go for the doctor, whose house was not far from Berkeley. It fitted in just right, for if there was any inquiry into his movements, he could furnish a good reason why he was late at the movies. Before he got to Grasslands he hid his wheel by the roadside and took a shortcut through the woods, lying low on the edge of them until he saw the kitchen lights go out. Crossing the lawn, the dogs ran at him barking, then got his scent and quieted down. At the balcony he slipped off his raincoat, put on sneakers, unlocked the front door with Mr. Price's key, and crept in. The job didn't take him 10 minutes. Just as he finished, he saw the box of Mr. Janney's cigars and helped himself to one. He rubbed off his fingerprints with an acid used for that purpose, left the broken chair just where it was, and departed. In the woods, he lit the cigar, carelessly throwing the band on the ground. 15 minutes later he was at the movies with the Grasslands help. When he saw in the papers that a light had been seen by the safe at 1:30, every fear he had died, for at that time he was back at Cedarbrook helping his landlady look after the sick child. He was too smart a crook to disappear right on top of the robbery, and hung around saying he was looking for another place. He met up with Larkin, but at first didn't know he was a detective. When the offer came from Ferguson, he took it, intending to stay a while, then say his folks in the old country needed him, and slip away to Spain. It was the day after he'd accepted Ferguson's offer that he learned what Larkin was, and saw that both he and the Janneys had their suspicions of Chapman Price. This disturbed him, but he couldn't throw up the job he'd just taken without exciting remark. To be ready, however, he dug up the jewels. He'd buried them in the woods and put them handy under the flooring of his room. One day, looking over Ferguson's things, he came on the cigar band in the box on the bureau. It gave him a jar, for he couldn't see why it was put there. He'd heard from the servants about Ferguson and Miss Maitland walking home that night through the woods, and began to wonder if maybe they'd found the band. The thought ruffled him up considerably, and then he put it out of his mind, telling himself it was one from a cigar Ferguson had brought from Grasslands and smoked in his room. Nevertheless, to be on the safe side, he threw it away, very much on the alert, as you may guess. It wasn't a week later that he had the interview with Ferguson about the band. Then he saw by the young man's manner and words why the little crushed circle of paper had a meaning of its own, and knew that the time had come to vanish. He still felt safe enough to do this without haste, not rousing any suspicion by a too sudden departure. His opportunity came quickly. On Friday morning he heard Ferguson tell the butler that he was going to town and would be away for a day or two. By the time he came back, his valet would be far afield. Right after Ferguson's departure, he put the jewels in a bag, and telling the butler the boss had given him the day and night off, prepared to leave. He was crossing the hall when the telephone rang. My message. And being wary of danger, answered it. It was only a lady asking for Mr. Ferguson, and calm and steady as his voice had made me, started out for the station. Mice and men again. I was the mouse this time. Gracious, what a battered mouse I was. Well, that's all. The tangled threads are straightened out and the word "end" goes at the bottom of this page. I'm glad to write it. Glad to be once again where you can say what you think and talk to people like they were harmless human beings without any dark secrets in their pasts or presents. And oh gee, how glad I am to be home. Back in my own little hole, back where there's only one servant and she a coon, back where I'm familiar with the food and know how to eat it, and blessedest of all, back to my own true husband, who thinks there's no sun or moon or stars when I'm out of the house. I'm going to get a new rug for the parlor, a fur-trimmed winter suit, a standing lamp with a Chinese shade, a pair of skates. Oh dear, I'm at the bottom of the page and there's no room for end, but I must squeeze in that I got that reward. Mrs. Janney said I'd earned every penny of it, and a wristwatch with a circle of diamonds round it from Dick Ferguson, and oh, pfft, if I keep on I'll never stop. So here goes, on a separate line, The End. End of Chapter 30. Recording by Holly Jenson. End of Miss Maitland, Private Secretary by Geraldine Bonner.